I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
So last week we ended off with question 8, and I switched them around. That's why we're beginning with question 7 this week. And Dave asks us, how do the following passages depict the defenselessness of Nineveh in the face of God's judgment? Just remember that at this time, Assyria, in the known world at that time, there wasn't any that could beat her. She was a powerful nation. She pretty much, whoever she wanted to conquer, she conquered. And now here, Nahum is, remember, telling Nineveh that God is going to destroy you. So we have our passages we looked at, and Nahum here in these passages compares Nineveh to something, to have them realize who they really are compared to God and his power. And so the first verse is Nahum chapter 1 and verse 10. Jeremy, I guess we'll start with you.
While tangled like thorns, and while drunken like drunkards, they shall be devoured like stubble fully dried.
Okay, now, what is Nahum is comparing Nineveh to something here? And what is that in that verse?
Tangled thorns. Tangled thorns.
Right, yeah, that's true. And while tangled, Jeremy?
Drunken drunkards and stubble, dried stubble.
Right. The dry stubble, well, each one of them we could speak about. Tangled thorns, usually, what would that bring to your mind? If they're all twisted together, they're not going to move much, they're locked up, they can't, comparing that with Nineveh, in other words, they're not going to move too freely. And drunkards,
It's good for fuel too, the tangled thorns. It's like branches that you cut up and wrapped, and it's just fit for the fire.
right, that's right, Kala. That's true, that I never thought of that comparison also. And the drunkards, in other words, staggering around, no mindset. And the devoured like stubble is just like a dry field, a grass fire. Compare that, easily burnt. And that is how Nahum is speaking to them in that way. And to them, that would sound bizarre, wouldn't it? It'd be a joke. I think we had said that earlier. Okay, in chapter 3 and verse 12. Tammy, I'll give you that verse.
All your strongholds are like fig trees with ripened figs. If they are shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater.
Okay. And what is Nahum comparing Nineveh to here? Because we all have fig trees in our backyards.
Especially mine.
Yeah, right, yeah, right. Especially Jeremy's, as he says in the condo. Well, fig trees, I had to look this up myself. Figs, when they're really ripe, are heavy. And they just literally fall off the tree. And that is the idea, speaking of it falling into the mouths of those below, of the eater. They just fall off the tree. And God is having Nineveh know that the strongholds on their borders, the ones that would notify the city first as someone was attacking it, they're going to fall just like a fig tree. In other words, defenselessness against God. And remembering always that Assyria believes in their own hearts that they are undestroyable, that no one can overtake them. And then chapter 3 and verse 13. Colin, you read that, please.
Behold, your troops in the midst of you are as weak and helpless as women. The gates of your land are set wide open to your enemies without effort. Fire consumes your bars.
Okay. Well, what is Nahum comparing Nineveh to here?
Well, Alice's verse actually went further than mine, but you don't think of soldiers as women.
Right.
I know today women are going into the army, but that was just not the case. Women at that time were not fighters. They were the men were seen as protectors of women. But they're saying you're sending your women out into battle. That's not a good thing. That's
Right.
not a good thing. You're not going to win doing that.
Right.
And the gates of your land are going to be wide open. If you have open gates, people can walk in.
Right.
And destroy the city.
That's right, Jared, that's right. I had its inhabitants are depicted as defenseless women. I thought I'd get jumped on for that statement, but Jared kind of explained it in a nice way. It's true. Even in our day and age, the amount of women in the army, there's far more men. And in this time, in this day and age, armies didn't have the tools, the weapons that we have nowadays. Back then, I mean, they were riding horses and wielding swords, throwing spears, and generally that, mind you, I know some girls that could probably throw a spear better than me, but generally, at that time, it would be the men. And the thought that Nineveh would take from that, they would understand that. Yes, the women, were generally working in the fields or tending to the household duties, and it was the men that went off to war. And thinking too of remember, Assyria was known for its despicable cruelty to people in battle. We spoke about the torture that they would do to the people that they conquered. And the thought came to me was that most women might have more common sense than to be that cruel. So it's just another thought that you wouldn't consider a woman to be in battle and be a soldier as like the men were. And so then verse 15 and 16. Lisa, do you want to read 15, and Howie, do you want to read 16? Okay. Have you got that, Lisa? Chapter 3, verse 15.
Make strong the great skin. There the fire will devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will eat you up like a locust. Make yourselves many like the locust. Make yourselves many like the swarming locust.
You have multiplied your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust plunders and flies away.
Okay. And so what's the picture here that Nahum is painting for us as we compare Nineveh to what God is saying of her? What is...
It's going to be desolate.
The which
She's
Jim?
going to be desolate, eaten up, because the locusts, even in our study, in our Exodus study, locusts just eat everything.
Right,
They come in and they leave nothing behind.
right.
So that's going to be Nineveh. It's just going to be devoured.
That's right. It's pictured as a field left bare. Remember that picture that I had found online, and we had it, I think, in the beginning of this study of Nahum. But we had a picture of all the locusts on a desert dune, on the side of a sand dune, and they had eaten and they were there resting. But it blew me away, the huge number of them, just millions of them. And once they go through something, there's nothing left.
If I remember right, I saw on, it was Planet Earth or something, it was a documentary about Death Valley, which is a desert. Every 20 years, it has bloom, like as far as grass and other
right.
things. But the locusts, like I said, they lay dormant.
Right.
And when it comes up, they'll just eat everything, and then they'll go, and that will be it.
Right.
And Death Valley only has grass once every 20 years for a week or so.
Oh, really?
And
Oh,
so,
that's interesting.
yeah, it was. I think that's what it was. I know. I think that's what they had said. So,
Oh,
it's
okay.
interesting.
Well, that's the point. That's the picture that Nahum is, and there's no stopping them, is there? Once once you get a plague of any insect, they're not easily stopped. And they do what they've set out to do, and that was to destroy everything. And so that is the picture. That's what it's going to be like when God's done with you. There'll be nothing. Your city will be leveled, just like a field that's been plowed under. There'll be nothing left. And then verse 17. Deanna, do you want to read that, please?
Your commanders are like swarming locusts, and your generals like great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges on a cold day. When the sun rises, they flee away, and the place where they are is not known.
Okay. There's one for all you insect scientists. What is Nahum comparing? Now he's comparing the commanders and the generals, right? And usually the job of the commander in general is to stand firm, to show no fear, right? He has to keep his troops motivated. But what does Nahum say of them? What are they depicted as? What does he say that insects do?
When the sun rises, they flee.
The which one?
When the sun rises, they flee.
Right. Right. And when it's cold out, they just hide too, don't they? They huddle and hide. And when the heat of the day, the noontime sun, they run and hide. And this is what he is comparing the generals and the commanders to. I pictured that as when they begin to witness the power of God, and when they begin to witness the devastation that's happening to them, that they're going to run and hide. They realize that no, they're not who they think they are. And they'll realize that they're dealing with a God who said that he would personally bring judgment upon Nineveh. If you turn back, and we may have read these, I'm not sure, but in chapter 2 and verse 13, Nahum said, this is Nahum's, but God is speaking. He says, "Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions." Remember, Assyria always depicted themselves as lions in all their idols, and they were usually bodies of lions with heads of men. And so here, Nahum, God is saying that I'll devour you. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall be heard no more. The thought of cutting off your prey, remember Syria just attack anybody. And there'll be none left to attack because they won't be able to attack. And he speaks directly to the city in a few passages. I'll just use chapter 1 and verse 14. The Lord has given you a command concerning you. Your name shall be perpetrated no longer. Out of the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the molded image, and I will dig your grave, God says to them, for you are vile. Remember we read that. But we just see that God is letting Nineveh know that he's going to inflict them with a wound that will never heal. And he tells them that, I think, chapter 3 and verse 19. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe. All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you. For upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually? So we get a picture there not only of what God is going to do to Nineveh, but we're getting a picture there of what Assyria has done, how they have lived their lives. They've just utterly destroyed everybody that came into their pathway, and they never showed any remorse for it. And something that I always keep reminding myself was, remember about 100 years before this, Nineveh repented of all this. Remember when Jonah went to them. And now we see, though, that maybe you could say some of the problem lies with the kings, their desire for power, but yet the people followed them. And we see that they just resorted back to what God had in the beginning forgiven them of. And they just set back in their own ways. So then we just had a picture here of the artists and archaeology have tried to put together. This is kind of what Nineveh would have looked like at the time. Remember, we were saying that you couldn't get into the city. It was that was part of its power. It was impregnable. And then along with that idea is, remember, they would have their fortresses outside of the city, who knows how far, maybe a quarter mile outside of the city, and they would be watching for enemies, and then news would be sent back. So it's just the idea, no wonder they were so proud, because at that time, and it kind of makes us think of our day and age, how our nations, you know, how often do we see from Asia, maybe not so much pictures of our army in America or Canada, although we hear lots of talk about it, rhetoric, but in Asia, you view the armies marching through their main streets of their towns, and it's kind of awe-inspiring, the amount of warfare that nations have, and that is their pride. They think they're invincible, you know, and Nineveh would have been the same way. But as back in that time as in our time, we know who has more power. It will not matter how much military power you have. When God decides with the nations today, or if he leaves the nations till the day of judgment, either way, they have no power to overtake our God. And so then we move along in our content of Nahum, and we come to now the reasons for Nineveh's fall. And we're asked in question 9, for what sins would God punish Nineveh according to the following passage? Remember, God's judgment is against Nineveh is described by Nahum as being especially severe. We read that in verse 19 of chapter 3. Maybe as compared to other nations that God has destroyed, kind of nothing can compare to what he is going to do to Nineveh. So our first passage was Nahum 1 and verse 14. Have you got that, Lynette? Okay.
And the Lord had given a commandment concerning them, that no more of the men be sown out of the house of God. Will I cut off the graven image and the molten image? I will make thy grave, and thou art the grave. Why?
Okay. Should have waited a minute before I read that verse. But what here is God going to, what's Nahum saying? One of the reasons why God is going to punish you. We find that in this verse. Do a little thinking.
Idolatry.
The which?
Idolatry.
Okay.
And well, as far as, well, it appears to me, it may have been on the page. It may not have been what you were looking for, but
No, that's heading in the right direction. But what was their attitude? What did their idols make them?
they're vile.
Right. Did it make them humble? No, right. Okay, that's where I was headed. Their trust in their gods filled them with their pride, didn't they? And the severity of their punishment was because, like Jeremy was saying, because of their mockery and their dishonoring of Jehovah. And something I had read in studying this was quite interesting. The Assyrians and the Babylonians, they had a policy when they went into battle to overtake cities and nations. They had a policy of destroying the idol gods of those that they conquered. And this effort would mock the power of their gods, whomever they have destroyed. And it would help in abolishing their religion. Whoever they overtook, they just destroyed everything those people worshiped. Okay? Then those people would begin to lose their trust in their gods and being under rule of the Assyrians. But it's interesting that the Romans, remember in the time of the New Testament, the Roman policy was exactly opposite to that. And I found that interesting, and I was wondering why, but the example was the Romans would let people worship their own gods. So they would have what? They'd have a group of happy people, somewhat. They might not like how the government ruled them, but they were allowed to keep their religion.
And that was prophesied in Daniel. Like as far as the Romans wanted empire, and they didn't care if everyone was made Roman.
Right.
They wanted people, and so if the Jews wanted to worship their gods, as long as they paid their taxes, that's fine. And same with everyone else. That's why the Roman Empire was so big. These other empires tried to show the people that they were better, and like as far as the conquering people were better, their gods were more powerful, and that generally didn't last so long.
No, right. Well, like we said, with Assyria and Babylon, their frame of mind was to destroy all the peoples anything that had to do with their religion. That way they figured they could keep their thumb on them and have them become better citizens, I guess. But we did say the idea of Assyria mocking and dishonoring God. And I went back to Isaiah 36 just to give us an example of how proud they were. In Isaiah chapter 36, and I'll read from verse 13 to the end of the chapter. In verse 13, then the Rav Shaka, he was a general, and he would report back to the next in command, and so that could have been anyone. But he stood and called out with a loud voice in Hebrew and said, "Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you." Remember this scene here, Assyria is coming to overtake them, and they're now speaking to them. "Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make peace with me by a present, and come out to me, and every one of you eat from his own vine, and every one from his own fig tree, and every one of you drink the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered its land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Do you get the picture here of what this guy is saying to Israel? And then verse 19, where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Indeed, have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their countries from my hand? That the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand. It's amazing, isn't it? The mockery that they're giving God. But they held their peace and answered him not a word. This is Israel. They answered him not a word. Or Judah, I should say, I guess it is. For the king's commandment was, Hezekiah told them, don't answer him. Don't argue with him. And then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rav Shaka. So I just took us to that passage just to give us an idea of what these Assyrians were truly like. Laughing at them. Don't listen to your king, Hezekiah. Put your trust in your God. What God haven't we destroyed? And we will destroy yours also. Amazing the pride that this nation had. And is it any different maybe when we think of today's world that we live in? So now we'll move on to chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. Henry, I'll get you and Cherry want to split up 1 and 3. Maybe you take 2 and give Cherry verse 3.
Okay.
Chapter 3, back in Nahum now, sorry.
The main one, chapter 3.
Yes.
watery flood city, its outflow from lies and robbery, its victims never depart. The noise of a beat and the noise of a rattling wheels, with the lapping horses of a clattering chariots.
Charging cavalry, flanking swords and gleaming rays, many castle hundreds of light, bodies without number, people standing over the corpses.
And Annie, do you want to read verse 8?
Are you better than perhaps that said by the Nile with water around her, for rampart a sea, water for wall?
And Tim, you read 9 and 10?
Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and he was boundless. What an ruin were your helpers, yet she was cried out for it. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed to pieces. In the head of every street, they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains.
And verse 11 says,
They also will be drunk, and you will be eaten. You also will seek refuge from the enemy.
okay, thanks guys. Okay, there's a couple things here, but what do these verses explain? What do you envision of Nineveh and the Assyrians as you read these verses?
Place of wickedness and sin. Like as far as robberies and harlotries, sorceries, and like as far as abominable filth, like as far as it's just a terrible place to like as far as sin goes. You might think of Sodom and Gomorrah
Right.
maybe in comparison to it.
That's right, Joe. That's what I thought of reading. And also, not only those sins, but what about their treatment? How did they treat other nations?
They oppress them.
The which one?
They oppress them.
Right. And also the cruel and ruthless treatment. We read there of the little children, dashing the children to pieces, and casting lots. Remember, for honorable men there, it speaks. Almost you envision casting lots. What can I do to this prisoner? I want that choice. It just, and also the thought of, that I wondered about when I first read it, and then it kind of came to me in verse, was it verse 8? Was it verse 1 and 3? Oh, the idea of its victim never departs. Woe to the bloody city. It is all full of lies and robbery. Its victim never departs. Nahum's not saying that your victims now can leave or are free from your oppression. It's in the Hebrew, that's what that is meaning, is that there was never someone around that Assyria couldn't destroy or didn't want to destroy. It didn't matter who they came across. That was their goal, to overpower that nation or that group of people and do to them whatever they chose. And that is just the idea of the gross attitude of this nation. And then verse 4 of chapter 3, what is God going to punish them for it here. I guess
I
Yeah.
thought that's what we read, but because of the multitude of harlotries and the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries, and families through her sorceries.
That's
I thought that's what we already read, but
I know you were reading ahead.
yeah.
You've studied this before. Well, harlotry here is used as a figure for infidelity and unfaithfulness to God on the part of Israel. But here the figure is used in a political meaning, like a prostitute who peddles her favors for a fee. Okay, Nineveh had hired out her powers to many nations, to weaker nations, but they did it with their own advantage clearly in mind. They would help those nations, but they would take something in return. And she was compared to a common prostitute who had beguiled and captured people from many nations, both with her charms and her bitter snares. That was the bell. We only have one more question. Maybe,
If you want to finish up next week, you can, Phil.
yeah, we'll leave that because we can look at question 10, and it comes under the character of God. Okay, and we need to consider that in everything that has happened in Nahum.
I'm not ashamed to